While Daniel Mercer sat beside his dying brother in a hospice outside Salt Lake City, an elderly woman across the hall stopped him at 2 a.m. and whispered, "Whatever your nephew tells you tomorrow, don't sign anything." Daniel almost ignored her. Less than 24 hours later, he discovered his nephew was preparing to steal his father's entire estate before the old man took his final breath. Daniel Mercer had been alone for almost 2 years when the phone rang at 11:47 on a Thursday night. He had fallen asleep in his recliner with the television still glowing blue across the living room walls of his small house in Phoenix. At 63, sleep came lightly these days. Ever since Susan died, the silence inside the house never truly settled. It creaked. It echoed. Some nights it felt as though grief itself had learned how to breathe. The call came from a number he did not recognize. "Mr. Mercer?" a woman asked gently. Daniel sat up immediately. "Yes? My name is Amanda. I'm calling from Silver Pines Hospice near Salt Lake City. Your brother Raymond listed you as emergency family contact." Daniel's stomach tightened before she even finished speaking. "He's declining quickly," the nurse continued. "You should come soon." For a moment, Daniel simply stared at the dark television screen. Raymond. His older brother. The man who had practically raised him after their father disappeared in 1968 with a waitress from Reno and never came back. Raymond had been 12 years old then. Daniel had only been 8. Raymond taught him how to shave, how to throw a baseball without hurting his shoulder, how to apologize when he was wrong. Every decent thing Daniel knew about being a man had started with Raymond Mercer, and now he was dying. Daniel packed without thinking. 3 shirts, jeans, a toothbrush, a bottle of blood pressure pills tossed carelessly into a duffel bag. 20 minutes later, he was heading north through the Arizona darkness in his aging Ford pickup. The drive stretched endlessly. Gas stations glowing alone in the desert. Cold coffee. Country radio fading in and out. Memories arriving uninvited. At sunrise, snow appeared along the distant mountains as he crossed into Utah. By the time he reached the hospice outside Salt Lake City, his back ached, and his eyes burned from 11 straight hours on the road. Silver Pines Hospice sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood behind rows of bare winter trees. The building looked more like a country inn than a medical facility. Soft yellow lights glowed through wide windows. Decorative wreaths still hung from the entrance, even though Christmas had passed weeks ago. Inside, the place smelled strongly of lavender, trying unsuccessfully to hide antiseptic and sickness. A woman at the front desk looked up gently. "You must be Daniel." He nodded. She hesitated before speaking again. "Your brother's been asking for you." Daniel followed her down a dim hallway lined with family photographs and muted lamps. Somewhere nearby, oxygen machines hummed steadily behind closed doors. When they reached Raymond's room, Daniel stopped breathing for half a second. His brother looked impossibly small. Raymond Mercer had once been a broad-shouldered carpenter who could carry lumber under each arm without slowing down. Now the blankets around him barely rose above the outline of fragile bones. His skin looked gray beneath the soft lighting. His hands trembled slightly against the sheets. But when Raymond opened his eyes and saw Daniel standing there, something alive flickered across his face. "Danny," he whispered weakly. Daniel stepped quickly beside the bed and took his brother's hand. "I'm here." Raymond squeezed his fingers with surprising strength. His dry lips moved again. "Did Ethan call you yet?" Daniel frowned slightly. "No. Why?" Raymond's tired eyes shifted toward the doorway for just a moment. Then he asked again, quieter this time. "Has Ethan arrived?" The first night inside Silver Pines Hospice, Daniel barely slept. He spent most of the hours sitting beside Raymond's bed, listening to the soft mechanical rhythm of the oxygen machine and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Outside the narrow window, snow drifted silently beneath the parking lot lights. Around 3 a.m, Raymond finally fell into a deeper sleep. Daniel carefully stood, his knees aching from sitting too long, and stepped into the hallway to stretch his back. That was the first time he noticed the old woman across the hall watching him. She sat in a wheelchair with a thick quilt folded over her knees. The television in her room was off. Only a small lamp beside her bed cast a pale golden light across her sharp cheekbones and silver hair. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel gave a tired nod. "Evening, ma'am." The woman studied him carefully before nodding once in return. "Your brother?" she asked quietly. "Yes. I'm sorry." Daniel thanked her softly and continued toward the coffee machine near the nurse's station. By the time he returned, her room door had already closed. The next morning, Raymond was awake longer, weak, but alert. Daniel helped him sip water through a straw while snow continued falling outside the window. Several times, Raymond tried to say something more than a sentence or two, but exhaustion kept pulling him back under. Still, one question kept returning. Any word from Ethan? Daniel found it strange. Raymond had always loved both his children equally, but now there seemed to be nervousness hidden beneath the question. Not excitement, not comfort, something else. By late afternoon, Daniel finally stepped into the common room to clear his head. The old woman from across the hall sat alone near the window, working on a crossword puzzle in ink. Daniel poured himself weak coffee and hesitated before walking over. "You mind if I sit?" "Free country," she answered without looking up. Up close, she looked somewhere in her late 70s, maybe older. Her hands were thin and covered with age spots, but her eyes remained startlingly clear. Daniel introduced himself. "Daniel Mercer." She nodded once. "Eleanor Whitmore." They sat in silence for a while. Snowflakes drifted past the large window beside them. Finally, Daniel noticed the crossword. "You do those in pen?" Eleanor gave the faintest smile. "If you're waiting until you're certain before writing something down, you waste half your life." That answer stayed with him longer than he expected. Over the next 2 days, Daniel saw her often. Sometimes she sat by the hallway window. Sometimes nurses rolled her slowly toward physical therapy. Sometimes she simply watched the corridor quietly while visitors came and went carrying flowers, balloons, and grief. She almost never had visitors herself. On the third morning, Daniel brought her a blueberry muffin from the small family kitchen down the hall. Eleanor accepted it politely. "Thank you." "That all right?" Daniel asked. "I've eaten worse." Again, the tiny hint of humor surprised him. That evening, Raymond slept most of the night. His breathing had changed. Slower now. Uneven. Daniel sat beside the bed holding his brother's frail hand while memories drifted through him like old film reels. Fishing trips. Baseball games. Raymond teaching him how to drive stick shift in an empty church parking lot. Near midnight, Daniel quietly stepped into the hallway again. As he passed Eleanor's room, her voice stopped him. "Your brother's afraid." Daniel turned. Eleanor sat awake in the dim light beside her bed, staring directly at him. "He talks in his sleep," she continued softly. "These walls are thinner than people think." Daniel tried to smile politely. "He's on a lot of medication." "That's not what I mean." Something in her tone made him pause. Eleanor folded her hands slowly across the blanket. "He keeps saying he waited too long," she whispered. "He keeps saying he should have changed it before the boy got here." A cold feeling moved quietly through Daniel's chest. "The boy?" he asked. "Your nephew." Daniel frowned. "Ethan's a good man." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I used to say the same thing about my son." Silence filled the room. Daniel suddenly became aware of the distant hum of oxygen machines again. The snow outside. The smell of lavender in the hallway. Then Eleanor leaned slightly closer. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered. "Whatever your nephew tells you when he arrives tomorrow, don't sign anything." Daniel stared at her. She held his gaze steadily. "Drive home if you can," she said. "I mean that." Daniel barely slept after Eleanor Whitmore's warning. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice again. "Don't sign anything." By sunrise, he had almost convinced himself the woman was simply projecting her own pain onto strangers. Hospice buildings were full of regret, loneliness, and old wounds. People carried unfinished battles into places like Silver Pines every day. Still, something about the certainty in Eleanor's eyes refused to leave him alone. The next morning, Raymond looked worse. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, and his hands trembled badly when Daniel helped him hold a cup of ice water. The nurses adjusted medication twice before noon. At times, Raymond drifted in and out of consciousness mid-sentence, but every so often his eyes would open suddenly, and every time, he asked the same question. "Ethan here yet?" Around 11 that morning, Daniel finally heard footsteps moving quickly down the hallway. A tall man in a charcoal gray coat appeared near the doorway, carrying a leather overnight bag. Ethan Mercer. Daniel had not seen his nephew in nearly 4 years. Time had changed him. The last Daniel remembered, Ethan still looked like the athletic kid who spent summers fishing with Raymond near Lake Chelan. Now there was silver at his temples, expensive shoes, a polished watch, the calm confidence of someone used to business meetings and airports. But the smile came instantly. "Uncle Danny." Ethan crossed the room quickly and wrapped Daniel in a firm embrace that lasted just a second too long. He smelled faintly of cologne and stale coffee. "I drove straight from Tacoma after Claire called," Ethan said. How bad is he? Daniel glanced toward the bed. You'll see. For a brief moment, something unreadable crossed Ethan's face before he walked toward his father. Raymond opened his eyes slowly as Ethan sat beside him. Hey, Dad, Ethan whispered gently. The old man stared at his son for several seconds. Then, something strange happened. Instead of relaxing, Raymond seemed tense. His breathing sped up slightly. His fingers tightened weakly against the blanket. Daniel noticed it immediately. So did Ethan. But Ethan simply smiled calmly and took his father's hand. You don't need to worry about anything, he said softly. I'm handling everything. Raymond's eyes shifted toward Daniel. There was fear in them, real fear. Daniel felt a quiet chill move through his stomach. For the next hour, Ethan played the role of devoted son perfectly. He adjusted Raymond's blankets, thanked nurses politely, asked careful questions about medication schedules. Twice he touched Daniel's shoulder sympathetically and said things like, "We'll get through this together." Anyone watching would have thought he was grieving with dignity and grace. Yet Daniel could not shake the memory of Eleanor's warning. Shortly after noon, Ethan stood and glanced toward the hallway. Uncle Danny, mind grabbing a coffee with me downstairs? Daniel hesitated. Sure. The hospice cafeteria was nearly empty, except for a volunteer refilling soup containers behind the counter. Snow continued falling outside the large windows. Ethan bought them both coffee and chose a quiet table near the back wall. Then his entire demeanor subtly shifted. Not colder exactly, sharper. More focused. He folded his hands neatly on the table. Dad's been stressed about the cabin, he said. Daniel immediately knew which cabin he meant. Raymond's lake house near Lake Chelan. Raymond had built most of it himself in the late 70s. The property alone was probably worth close to $1 million now. Daniel took a slow sip of coffee. What about it? Ethan exhaled carefully. The probate situation could turn ugly if we don't move quickly. Daniel said nothing. Ethan leaned slightly closer. Dad wanted me to simplify everything before. He paused delicately. Before things get worse. Something tightened quietly in Daniel's chest. What kind of simplification? A transfer, Ethan answered smoothly. Mostly paperwork. Temporary authority over the property, accounts, insurance. Things that'll make handling final expenses easier. Daniel stared at him. Claire knows about this? Ethan smiled instantly. Of course she does. But this time, Daniel noticed it. The smile never reached his eyes, and somewhere deep in his memory, Eleanor Whitmore's voice whispered again, "Don't sign anything." Daniel returned to Raymond's room with a heaviness he could not explain. Ethan walked beside him calmly, carrying both coffees as though nothing unusual had been discussed downstairs. But now Daniel noticed things he had ignored before. The way Ethan always answered questions immediately. The way he controlled conversations without seeming to. The way Raymond's eyes followed him nervously whenever paperwork or finances were mentioned. Back inside the hospice room, Raymond appeared exhausted. His eyes barely opened as Ethan stepped close to the bed again. "Dad," Ethan said gently, "I talked with Uncle Danny. We're going to take care of everything." Raymond looked toward Daniel instead of answering. For a long moment, the old man simply stared at his younger brother. Then, very faintly, he whispered, "Claire." Ethan answered before Daniel could. "Claire knows, Dad. Don't worry." Raymond's face tightened slightly. Not relief, discomfort. Daniel felt it clearly now. Something was wrong. Around 2 that afternoon, snowstorm clouds darkened the hospice windows. Nurses moved quietly through the hallways, adjusting blankets and medication trays, while families whispered beside half-closed doors. Daniel had just returned from the vending machines when he saw a man in a brown wool coat entering the hallway, carrying a black leather briefcase. The man approached the nurses' station first. Then he glanced toward Raymond's room. "Looking for Ethan Mercer," he said. Daniel stopped walking. The nurse pointed toward the doorway. Ethan appeared almost immediately, smiling as though he had been expecting him. "There he is," Ethan said warmly. "Thanks for coming on short notice." The 2 men shook hands. Daniel heard the word notary. A cold pressure settled quietly into his chest. Ethan looked toward him. "Uncle Danny, perfect timing." Daniel said nothing. The notary opened his briefcase while walking into Raymond's room. Inside were neatly organized folders, clipped documents, and several signature tabs already marked with yellow stickers. Too prepared. Far too prepared. Raymond looked confused as the men gathered around his bed. "Dad," Ethan said softly, "remember what we talked about? We're just getting the paperwork finalized so Uncle Danny doesn't have to deal with probate headaches later. Raymond blinked slowly. His lips parted as though trying to speak. No words came out. The notary began arranging papers on the rolling hospital tray over the bed. Standard transfer documentation, he explained professionally. We'll make this quick and painless. Daniel stepped closer. I'd like to read everything first. For the first time since arriving, Ethan hesitated, only for half a second, but Daniel saw it. Then the smooth smile returned. Of course, Ethan said lightly. Though, honestly, Uncle Danny, it's mostly legal language. Dad already approved all this. Daniel extended his hand. The notary handed him the top document. At first glance, it appeared exactly as Ethan described, a property transfer involving Raymond's cabin near Lake Chelan. But underneath that paper sat a second document, and underneath that one, a third. Daniel slowly pulled the stack closer. The second document granted Ethan immediate power of attorney over all of Raymond's finances and medical authority, effective immediately. Daniel's stomach tightened. He looked up sharply. What's this? Ethan answered smoothly. Just temporary authority, in case Dad becomes incapacitated before everything settles. Daniel kept reading. The third document made his blood run cold. A beneficiary change form for Raymond's Union life insurance policy. $400,000. Claire Mercer's name appeared faintly beneath fresh, typed lettering, where Ethan Mercer had now been inserted instead. Daniel looked at Ethan slowly. The room had become completely silent, except for Raymond's weak breathing and the distant hum of machines in the hallway. You said this was about the cabin, Daniel said quietly. It is, Ethan replied carefully. Then why are you changing insurance beneficiaries? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Claire agreed to it. Daniel stared at him. Did she? This time, Ethan's smile slipped just enough for Daniel to finally see what had been hiding underneath it all day. Impatience. Calculation. Desperation. The notary shifted uncomfortably beside the bed. Raymond's trembling hand moved weakly against the blanket, as though trying to reach for something or someone. Then Daniel remembered Eleanor's exact words, "Don't sign anything." And suddenly, for the first time, he understood why she had sounded afraid. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. The hospice room suddenly felt smaller than before. Too warm. Too quiet. The soft hum of Raymond's oxygen machine filled the silence, while snow pressed against the windows outside like pale shadows. Ethan stood perfectly still across the bed, waiting. Daniel looked down again at the document spread across the rolling tray. The property transfer alone would have given Ethan complete ownership of the Lake Chelan cabin, worth nearly $1 million. But the other paperwork made something painfully clear. This had never been about simplifying probate. This was a takeover. Fast. Quiet. Timed carefully around a dying man who could barely stay conscious long enough to finish a sentence. Daniel looked toward Raymond. His brother's eyes were open now, glassy with medication and exhaustion, but fully aware and terrified. Raymond's mouth moved weakly. Danny. Daniel stepped closer immediately. I'm right here. Raymond tried again to form words. His trembling hand lifted slightly from the blanket before falling back against the bed. Ethan moved quickly to interrupt. Dad's exhausted, he said smoothly. We really should finish this before the medication cycle starts again. Daniel ignored him. Instead, he turned another page carefully. There were signature tabs everywhere. Prepared in advance. Organized. Calculated. The power of attorney document alone would give Ethan immediate access to Raymond's bank accounts, retirement funds, medical authority, property decisions. Everything. And Raymond had maybe 2 days left to live. Daniel finally looked directly at Ethan. You planned all this before you got here. Ethan's face hardened slightly. I planned for reality. No, Daniel said quietly. You planned for your father to die. The notary cleared his throat awkwardly beside the bed. Gentlemen, he began carefully. Perhaps I should step outside while you discuss. Stay, Daniel said firmly. The notary froze. Daniel turned back toward Ethan. You told me Claire agreed to these insurance changes. She did. Then we'll call her. Something flashed across Ethan's face immediately. Too quick for most people to notice. But Daniel saw it. Fear. Then Ethan recovered. Claire's emotional, he said calmly. She's overwhelmed right now. So we call her anyway. There's no need to create drama in Dad's final hours. Daniel's voice became colder. If everything's legitimate, then there won't be any drama. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. For the first time, the polished professional mask began slipping, just slightly. You don't understand the financial situation, he said quietly. Daniel stared at him. What financial situation? Ethan glanced toward the door as if considering escape routes. Then finally, he spoke. I've been helping Dad financially for years. Raymond's eyes suddenly widened. Weakly, he shook his head against the pillow. Daniel noticed immediately. You're lying, he said. Ethan ignored him. Do you know how expensive his care became after the cancer spread? Ethan continued. The cabin taxes alone. Claire doesn't know about this paperwork, does she? Silence. The answer was there instantly. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Ethan stepped forward. Uncle Danny, stop! Daniel already had Claire's number open. He pressed call. The room stayed silent except for the ringing speakerphone tone echoing softly between the hospice walls. Once. Twice. Then Claire answered. Hello? Her tired voice crackled through the speaker. Claire, Daniel said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. A pause. Okay. Daniel glanced at Ethan while speaking. Did you agree to remove your name from your father's life insurance policy? Complete silence. Then confusion. What? Daniel's chest tightened. The insurance policy, he repeated. Did you agree to transfer it entirely to Ethan? Claire sounded genuinely stunned now. I don't even know what you're talking about. Ethan immediately stepped closer to the phone. Claire, listen. But she cut him off instantly. Ethan, what did you do? The room changed at that moment. The last fragile piece of Ethan's story collapsed completely. Even the notary looked disturbed now. Raymond closed his eyes tightly against the pillow, and Daniel finally understood the horrible truth. His brother had been trapped inside this room, watching his own son prepare to strip away everything he had built before he was even gone. Ethan's calm expression vanished completely. Dad owed me, he snapped suddenly. Nobody knows how much I sacrificed for this family. Raymond weakly shook his head again, tears sliding from the corners of his eyes. Daniel stepped between the bed and Ethan. Get out. Ethan stared at him. You're making a mistake. No, Daniel said quietly. You already made it. For several long seconds, nobody moved.
Then Ethan grabbed the documents violently from the tray table, shoved them back into the leather folder, and walked toward the door without another word. As the door slammed shut behind him, Raymond finally broke down, silently crying into the pillow, and Daniel took his brother's trembling hand and held it tightly through the long winter night. After Ethan left the room, silence settled over Silver Pines Hospice like heavy snow. Daniel remained beside Raymond's bed, holding his brother's hand, while the notary quietly gathered the untouched paperwork from the floor where Ethan had dropped several pages during his exit. The man looked deeply uncomfortable. I had no idea, he said softly. Daniel nodded tiredly. I know. The notary hesitated another moment before closing his briefcase. For what it's worth, he added carefully, your brother didn't appear competent enough to sign legal documents today anyway. Daniel looked toward Raymond. His brother's eyes were still wet with tears. The old carpenter stared weakly toward the ceiling, breathing unevenly beneath the soft hiss of oxygen. The notary gave a small, respectful nod and quietly left the room. A few minutes later, Claire called back. Daniel stepped into the hallway to answer. Her voice was shaking immediately. What the hell is happening up there? Daniel leaned heavily against the wall outside Raymond's room. I think Ethan tried to move everything into his name before your father passed. Claire went silent. Then Daniel heard her crying softly. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. He kept asking weird questions about Dad's accounts these past few months. He kept pressuring Dad to sell the cabin. Daniel closed his eyes. Why didn't you tell anybody? I didn't want to believe it. That answer hurt more than Daniel expected, because it sounded exactly like his own thoughts. He had ignored the warning signs too, not because they were invisible, because accepting them meant accepting that someone they loved had changed into someone else. Claire took a shaky breath. I'm getting on a flight tonight. You don't have to rush. Yes, she interrupted firmly. I do. Daniel heard determination replacing grief now. I'm not leaving Dad alone with Ethan again. After the call ended, Daniel stood quietly in the hallway for a long moment. Across from Raymond's room, Eleanor Whitmore's door remained slightly open. The old woman sat in her wheelchair beside the darkened window, watching him silently. Daniel slowly walked toward her room. "You were right," he admitted quietly. Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I know." Daniel almost laughed at the bluntness of it. Instead, he leaned tiredly against her doorway. "How did you see it so fast?" Eleanor looked down at her folded hands beneath the quilt. "Because I've seen desperation before." The hallway lights reflected faintly in her pale eyes. "My son Gregory looked exactly like that near the end." Daniel said nothing. Eleanor continued softly. "People think greed looks loud and ugly. Most of the time, it doesn't." She glanced toward Raymond's room. "Most of the time, it looks calm, helpful, organized." That sentence settled heavily inside Daniel's chest. Helpful. Organized. Exactly. Around midnight, Claire finally arrived at the hospice. She came into Raymond's room still wearing her winter coat, exhausted from travel, snow melting in her dark hair. The moment she saw her father lying weakly in the bed, she broke down completely. Raymond opened his eyes slowly. "Claire Bear," he whispered faintly. Daniel had not heard that nickname in decades. Claire rushed beside the bed and held both of Raymond's hands carefully against her face. "I'm here, Dad." For the first time since Ethan arrived, Raymond finally looked peaceful, not comfortable, not healthy, but relieved. The three of them stayed together through the night while snow continued falling outside Silver Pines Hospice. Sometimes Raymond slept. Sometimes he drifted awake long enough to squeeze Claire's fingers weakly. Near 4 in the morning, he motioned weakly for Daniel to lean closer. Daniel bent beside him carefully. Raymond's voice barely existed now. "So sorry." Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, don't do that." Raymond swallowed painfully. "Didn't see what he became." Daniel felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Neither did I." Raymond looked toward Claire weakly, then back toward Daniel. "Protect her. You have my word," Daniel whispered. Raymond relaxed slightly against the pillow after hearing that. Outside the room, the hospice hallway remained quiet, except for distant footsteps and the soft, rolling sound of medication carts. At 5:17 that morning, Raymond Mercer took one final, uneven breath. Claire began sobbing immediately. Daniel lowered his head quietly beside the bed, and across the hall, through the partially open doorway, Eleanor Whitmore closed her eyes, as though she had been waiting for that moment too. Raymond Mercer was buried 3 days later, beneath a gray winter sky outside Salt Lake City. Snow covered the cemetery grass in uneven patches, while cold wind moved quietly through the bare trees surrounding the chapel. The funeral itself remained small. Claire sat beside Daniel in the front row, wearing a black coat that looked too thin for the weather. She had barely spoken since Raymond passed. Ethan never came. Not to the viewing, not to the church, not to the burial. At first, Daniel expected anger over the confrontation at hospice. But as the days passed, another possibility began creeping into his thoughts. Maybe Ethan stayed away because he already knew he had lost. After the service ended, people drifted slowly toward their cars, while Daniel remained beside Raymond's grave for several extra minutes, staring at the fresh dirt. His older brother was gone. The man who had spent most of his life protecting everyone else had died, frightened, inside a hospice room, because he realized too late that his own son could not be trusted. That truth sat heavily inside Daniel's chest. The following Monday, Claire drove them both north toward Raymond's attorney's office near Lake Chelan. The drive felt strangely quiet. Snow still covered parts of the mountains, and frozen water glimmered beneath the cloudy afternoon sky as they approached the lake town Raymond had loved most of his life. Claire finally spoke after nearly an hour of silence. "I keep replaying everything." Daniel looked toward her. "What part?" "All of it." She swallowed hard. The money questions, the pressure, Ethan suddenly wanting access to Dad's accounts. I saw it happening, but I kept telling myself he was stressed. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounded familiar too. People rarely missed warning signs because they were invisible. They missed them because the truth hurt too much to accept. Victoria Hale's law office sat above a hardware store on a quiet downtown street. The building smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Victoria herself looked to be somewhere in her 60s. Sharp eyes, silver hair pulled neatly back. The kind of woman who noticed details before other people realized they mattered. She greeted Claire warmly. Then she looked toward Daniel. "You're the reason your brother's estate survived last week." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, that was somebody else." Victoria studied him briefly, but didn't press further. Inside her office, she opened a thick file folder stamped with Raymond Mercer's name. "Your brother updated his will 6 years ago after his wife passed," she explained carefully. Everything was very clearly documented. Claire sat forward, nervously. Victoria adjusted her glasses and began reading. The Lake Chelan cabin would be sold eventually and divided equally between Ethan and Claire. Raymond's Union life insurance policy, $400,000, was entirely designated to Claire. His savings accounts, retirement funds, and investments were to be split 3 ways. 1 portion to Claire, 1 to Ethan, and the final portion donated to a trade scholarship fund for local apprentices entering construction work. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Raymond. Fair, simple, decent. Victoria placed several additional papers on the desk. "These," she said quietly, "are copies of the documents Ethan attempted to execute at Hospice." Claire's face paled immediately. The changes were devastating. Ethan would have inherited the cabin outright, taken control of the savings through power of attorney, received the insurance money. Almost everything would have shifted into his hands before Raymond even passed away. Claire whispered softly, "Oh my God." Victoria folded her hands together. If those documents had been signed under questionable competency conditions, litigation could have lasted years. Daniel looked toward the window silently. Years. Families destroyed over paperwork pushed across a dying man's bed. Victoria finally turned toward him. "What made you question it?" Daniel thought immediately of the old woman across the hall, Eleanor Whitmore, sitting beneath dim hallway lights, wrapped in her quilt. "Don't sign anything." Daniel exhaled slowly. "A stranger warned me." Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly. "Well," she said quietly, "that stranger may have saved your brother's final wishes." Later that afternoon, Daniel drove back toward Silver Pines Hospice alone. He stopped at a small bakery outside town first and bought a box of lemon pastries Eleanor once mentioned liking. The entire drive, he kept thinking about her, about how easily she could have stayed silent, how close he had come to ignoring her completely. By the time he reached the hospice parking lot, snow had started falling again. Inside, the same lavender scent filled the hallway, the same soft lighting, the same quiet hum of machines. Daniel approached the front desk, carrying the pastry box carefully. The nurse on duty recognized him immediately, but when he asked for Eleanor Whitmore, her expression changed, and suddenly Daniel knew something was wrong. The nurse lowered her voice before speaking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer," she said gently. "Ms. Whitmore passed away Thursday night." Daniel stood motionless at the front desk. For a moment, the words simply floated in the air around him without fully settling. Passed away Thursday night. Only 2 days after Raymond. The pastry box suddenly felt awkward and meaningless in his hands. "Oh," he said quietly. The nurse's expression softened further. She went peacefully. Daniel looked down the familiar hallway toward Eleanor's room. The door stood open now, empty. No wheelchair, no crossword puzzles, no dim lamp glowing beside the window, just silence. The strange thing was how deeply the loss hit him. He had only spoken to Eleanor Whitmore a handful of times, yet somehow she already felt tied permanently to one of the most painful weeks of his life. The nurse hesitated. "Actually," she added softly, "she left something for you." Daniel looked up. The woman disappeared briefly into a back office before returning with a plain white envelope. His name was written across the front in shaky handwriting. Daniel Mercer. The sight of it tightened something painfully inside his chest. "She gave this to us Wednesday morning," the nurse explained. "She said if you came back, we should make sure you got it." Daniel took the envelope carefully. "Thank you." Outside, snow drifted quietly across the hospice parking lot as Daniel sat alone on a wooden bench near the entrance. The winter air stung his face, but he barely noticed. For several seconds, he simply stared at the envelope resting in his hands. Then slowly, he opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting leaned sharply to the right, uneven in places but still readable. Daniel unfolded it carefully and began to read. "Mr. Mercer, I do not know if you listened to me or not. I hope you did. My son's name was Gregory Whitmore. 20 years ago, I trusted him with everything after my husband died. The accounts, the house, my medical decisions, all of it. By the time I realized what he was doing, there was nothing left." Daniel swallowed hard and continued. "He took the savings first. Then he borrowed against the house without telling me. When I became sick, he sold the property entirely and placed me into a facility smaller than this one. I spent years defending him to people who tried to warn me." That line hit Daniel hardest of all because he understood it now. The terrible human instinct to protect people we love from suspicion, even after the evidence begins appearing. Snow gathered quietly along the edge of Daniel's boots while he kept reading. The worst part was not losing the money. The worst part was realizing people saw what was happening and stayed silent because they believed it wasn't their place. "I promised myself then that if I ever saw it happening again, I would speak, even if nobody wanted to hear it. So I spoke to you. Whatever happens next, I hope your brother's wishes remain safe. And I hope someday you forgive yourself for almost trusting the wrong person. Good men often do. Sincerely, Eleanor Whitmore." Daniel lowered the letter slowly. The parking lot blurred slightly as tears filled his eyes. He sat there for a long time, listening to distant traffic and the muffled sound of wind moving through the bare winter trees. A nurse eventually stepped outside to smoke near the loading area. She glanced toward him carefully. "You okay out here?" Daniel nodded after a moment. "Yeah," he answered softly. "I think so." But the truth was more complicated because Eleanor's letter had forced him to confront something painful. The danger had not come from a stranger. It had come from someone Raymond loved most. And deep down, Raymond had known it before the end. That realization stayed with Daniel the entire drive back toward Salt Lake City. By the time he reached his hotel that night, Claire had left 2 missed calls. When he returned them, her voice sounded tense. "There's something else," she said quietly. Daniel sat heavily on the edge of the hotel bed. "What now?" Claire hesitated. "I started looking through Dad's old financial records." Daniel felt his stomach tighten immediately. "And?" Another pause. "Ethan's name keeps showing up everywhere." The room suddenly felt colder. Claire continued carefully. "Large transfers, loans, withdrawals Dad never mentioned." Daniel closed his eyes slowly. "How much?" "I don't know yet," she whispered. "But I think this has been going on for years." And for the first time since leaving hospice, Daniel realized the attempted theft at Raymond's bedside might not have been Ethan's first betrayal. It might only have been the one that finally got caught. The deeper Claire and Daniel looked into Raymond Mercer's finances, the worse everything became. What first appeared to be a few questionable transfers slowly unfolded into years of hidden manipulation. At first it was small amounts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Checks Raymond had written to Ethan with vague notes in the memo lines. Temporary help, investment bridge, business expense. Daniel wanted desperately to believe there had once been honest explanations behind those payments, but the numbers kept growing. By February, Victoria Hale had hired a forensic accountant to review Raymond's records more thoroughly. The findings stunned everyone involved. Over the last 6 years, Ethan had drained nearly $200,000 from his father through loans that were never repaid. Even worse, Raymond had repeatedly refinanced portions of the Lake Chelan property to help Ethan cover debts Daniel never knew existed. Credit cards, personal loans, private gambling markers, and still Raymond kept protecting him. Claire sat silently across from Daniel one afternoon inside Victoria's office, while another spreadsheet was slid across the desk. "I don't understand," Claire whispered. Dad knew Ethan had problems. Why would he keep giving him money? Daniel answered quietly before Victoria could, because he was his son. That was the cruel part. Raymond had not been foolish. He had been hopeful. There was a difference. Parents often kept believing in versions of their children that no longer existed. Daniel understood that now more than ever. In early spring, Ethan finally contacted him directly. The email arrived just after midnight, while Daniel sat alone in his kitchen back in Phoenix. The subject line read, "You destroyed this family." Daniel stared at it for several seconds before opening it. The message stretched nearly 4 pages long. At first, Ethan sounded calm. Misunderstandings, stress, grief. Then gradually, the anger surfaced underneath. "You embarrassed me in front of strangers. Dad wanted me handling things. Claire manipulated you because she always hated me." Near the end, the tone became openly bitter. If you had trusted family instead of some dying old woman, none of this would have happened. Daniel stopped reading there because that sentence revealed everything. Even now, Ethan still believed the problem was exposure, not what he had done. Daniel deleted the email without replying. Weeks later, another phone call arrived unexpectedly. This one came from a woman named Margaret Dawson in Tacoma. Her voice sounded exhausted. "My father passed away last month," she explained carefully. While going through his records, we found Ethan Mercer's name several times. Daniel felt immediate dread settle into his stomach. Margaret continued, "My father loaned him $47,000 over 3 years. Ethan claimed he was facing temporary financial issues, and the money never came back?" "No." She paused shakily. "My father was embarrassed. He never told us until we found his notebook after he died." Daniel closed his eyes slowly. The pattern was becoming undeniable now. Margaret was not the only one. Over the following months, more stories emerged. An elderly contractor Ethan convinced to invest in a fake property deal. A retired widow who co-signed a private loan Ethan disappeared from. Former clients claiming Ethan manipulated financial documents while working insurance accounts. Every story sounded slightly different, but underneath them all lived the same thing. Charm, urgency, pressure, promises. Victoria eventually uncovered the full scale of Ethan's situation. Nearly $300,000 in unsecured debt, 2 civil lawsuits already pending in Washington state, a hidden gambling addiction that had quietly consumed almost every part of his adult life. And suddenly, the hospice incident made horrifying sense. The Lake Chelan cabin had not simply been inheritance greed. It had been desperation. If Ethan gained control of the property before Raymond died, He could refinance or leverage it immediately to keep creditors away a little longer. The hospice room had been his last gamble. Claire took the revelation especially hard. One evening, she called Daniel, crying uncontrollably. "I keep thinking about Dad apologizing before he died." Daniel stayed quiet. "He thought this was his fault," she whispered. "He thought he failed Ethan somehow." Daniel stared silently through his kitchen window into the dark desert night. Maybe Raymond had failed to ask hard questions years earlier. Maybe the entire family had. But Ethan still made his own choices. And those choices finally caught up with him. 19 months after Raymond's death, Ethan Mercer stood trial in Washington for financial fraud involving several elderly victims. Daniel attended only one day of testimony. That was enough. He barely recognized the man sitting at the defense table anymore. The confidence was gone. The polished charm, too. All that remained was exhaustion and bitterness. When the guilty verdict came, Claire cried quietly, not from relief, from grief, because even justice could not give them back the person they once believed Ethan had been. Ethan Mercer was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes before delivering the sentence, carefully listing the financial damage left behind across multiple families and elderly victims. Fraud, exploitation, financial abuse against vulnerable people who trusted him. Daniel listened quietly from the back row of the courtroom in Washington. Claire sat beside him, holding a folded tissue tightly between trembling fingers. Neither of them celebrated when the sentence was announced. There was no victory in any of it, only sadness. Because somewhere beneath the crimes, the lies, and the greed, still lived the memory of the boy Raymond once carried on his shoulders beside the lake. That was the hardest part, loving the memory of someone you no longer recognized. After the trial ended, Claire walked silently beside Daniel toward the parking garage. Snow drifted lightly between the tall buildings downtown. "He kept looking at us," Claire whispered. Daniel nodded. "I know. He still thinks we betrayed him." Daniel stopped walking for a moment. "No," he said quietly. "He thinks we stopped protecting him from consequences." Claire looked down without answering. Over the next year, life slowly rearranged itself into something quieter. Claire sold the Lake Chelan cabin exactly the way Raymond requested in his will. Half the money went into college accounts for her children. The rest helped establish the trade scholarship fund Raymond always wanted. Daniel returned home to Phoenix, but things no longer felt quite the same there either. Susan's old coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet. The house still creaked at night. But now another voice lived inside his thoughts too. Eleanor Whitmore's. "If I ever see it happening again, I'll speak." About a year after the trial, Claire invited Daniel to a small senior center outside Portland, where she had begun volunteering twice a month. At first, Daniel assumed they were simply helping organize paperwork workshops for retirees. Then he saw the room filling with elderly couples carrying folders, bank statements, wills, and handwritten notes. People came with questions, concerns, suspicions they felt guilty even speaking aloud. A grandson suddenly asking for account access. A daughter pressuring signatures during medical treatments. A caregiver moving money between accounts. And Daniel realized something terrible. Their story was not unusual at all. It was happening everywhere. Claire stood before the room that first evening, holding Eleanor's letter in both hands. She read portions of it aloud, quietly, especially the line that mattered most. The worst part was realizing people saw what was happening and stayed silent because they believed it wasn't their place. The room became completely silent. Several people cried softly. Afterward, an older man approached Daniel near the coffee table. "My son's been pushing me to refinance my house," he admitted carefully. "I thought maybe I was imagining things." Daniel looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Slow everything down," he said gently. Anybody who truly loves you can wait a few days. That became the advice he repeated most often after that. Slow down. Read everything. Call somebody with nothing to gain. The people who love you will wait. The people who don't, won't. 3 years after Raymond's death, Daniel drove through Salt Lake City again while returning from visiting Claire and her children. Without planning to, he found himself turning towards Silver Pines Hospice. The building looked exactly the same. Soft lights glowing warmly through the windows. Bare winter trees along the sidewalk. Lavender drifting faintly through the cold air near the entrance. Daniel remained parked across the street for several minutes, staring up at the second-floor hallway windows. Somewhere behind one of them, Eleanor Whitmore had chosen to spend part of her final days protecting a stranger she barely knew. Not because she had to, because nobody had protected her. Daniel thought about that often now, how one uncomfortable sentence, spoken at the right moment, had changed everything. Raymond's wishes were honored, Claire's future stayed secure, and Daniel himself had been spared the lifelong guilt of signing away his brother's legacy. Before pulling away from the curb, Daniel looked one last time toward the hospice windows. Then quietly, almost like a prayer, he whispered into the empty truck cab, "Thank you, Eleanor.